Welcome to Eye for Iran, where we go beyond the headlines to examine the power plays shaping Iran in the Middle East. In this episode, we turn our focus to President Trump's high-stakes tour of the Persian Gulf. His stops in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE weren't just about trillion-dollar arms and energy deals. They were part of a broader strategy to potentially isolate Iran, realign U.S. influence, and signal a new era in regional diplomacy. From addressing the Iranian people directly to calling out the regime's corruption, Trump's remarks triggered a wave of reaction, not just in Tehran, but across Persian-language social media. Now, was this a step toward a new nuclear deal or a provocation that strengthens Iran's hardliners? What do Persian Gulf leaders really make of Trump's message, and what does this moment say about shifting alliances in the region? Joining us to unpack it all is Ghaith al-Omari, a former Palestinian negotiator who sat at the table during Camp David and now serves as a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. With first-hand experience in both Middle East diplomacy and Washington policy, his insights offer a rare dual-lens view on what's unfolding.
For many of us, of my generation at least, who grew up in the region, we always looked at Iran as this kind of hub of culture. When the president compared what you see in Riyadh, and I've been in Riyadh recently, and it's just, it's mind-boggling, the construction, the modernization, the infrastructure, and compare it with what you're seeing in Iran, rolling electricity blackouts, etc. These are the choices that I think the president put them in very, very stark terms.
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Ghaith al-Omari joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you so much for being here, Ghaith.
Thank you, Negar. It's an honor.
Thank you. Let's begin with the recent tragic and deeply disturbing event, the shooting of an Israeli embassy staff member and his soon-to-be wife, right in Washington, D.C. First of all, how do you feel?
Look, on a purely human level, this is just tragic. It's just tragic. I was actually invited to the event. In the end, I decided not to go. I know people who were there. It's awful, obviously, for the families of the victim, for everyone involved. That's on a personal level, on a human level. But also, this tells us that there is something very problematic in the public discourse that led into this. Look, I am a former Palestinian negotiator. I believe in the right of Palestinians to have their own state. Yet, when you have slogans like globalize the intifada, slogans that cross very blatantly into anti-Semitism, this is kind of radicalization that's been going on in our public discourse here. And shocking and saddening as what happened yesterday was, unfortunately, it was not surprising. This kind of rhetoric produces these kinds of results. And I think this should be a wake-up call to everyone, first and foremost, for anyone who identifies as pro-Palestinian, to disown and distance and dissociate with this kind of narrative, because this is morally and ethically wrong and produces tragic results.
Now, how do you interpret this attack in the broader context of, rising regional tensions and recent U.S. diplomacy, and how might it shape Washington's posture potentially towards Iran, to Palestinians, to Israel, and to Arab allies in the region?
First of all, let's wait and see what the investigations show. If there is an outside angle to it, then certainly this will have not only political domestic American impact.
Do you think there is?
Policy.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think there is an outside angle potentially?
I just don't know. Honestly, there's an ongoing investigation. I will not attempt to second guess it. Let's see what comes out of it. Look, in the most immediate, if you wish, kind of narrow sense, what this did is that this ensured that there will be no American pressure on Israel to moderate its military operation in Gaza. At this moment, I just cannot see the U.S. president coming and pressing the Israelis to moderate their war, even though, just days ago, we were hearing some discomfort coming from the White House when it comes to that. So that's kind of on a narrow level. On a wider level, though, I suspect this is the kind of attack that is just not going to stop what so far has been a positive trend in the region. You put aside the Gaza war. Actually, the president's trip was a huge success. The president's trip empowered some of the most positive actors in the region right now. When you go and see what's happening in Saudi Arabia today, in terms of rebuilding that society, rebuilding that narrative, what we saw in the UAE, the same. The president goes and says, "This is the Middle East we want to see." It empowers this narrative. To me, it was no surprise that today two Arab states officially actually condemned the attack. The United Arab Emirates came out, and then after that, Qatar, which is a problematic actor. Yet I think after the trip of the president, felt that it had to come out and condemn the attack. So I think the positive actors are being empowered, which obviously means that the negative actors feel more compelled to become spoilers. That's what we're seeing coming from the Iranians. That's what we're seeing coming from the Muslim Brotherhood. And a lot of these, because they see that the tide is against them, and I suspect the US will continue supporting these positive trends in the region.
So do you feel then that President Trump's recent trip to the Persian Gulf then strengthened those ties between him and those Arab allies?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every Arab official I've spoken to since, and I look at the Arab media, etc., it was a huge success. You know, beyond the obvious being the deepening the defense relations, the economic relations, etc. I think the region was very happy with one line that was in one of the president's speeches that got very little attention in Washington, where he basically said, you know, we tried in the West to come and teach you state building and nation building, etc., etc. Then you came and built a model of success that is Arab in its nature. What you see in Saudi today is not an American replica. It's not a European replica. It is a Saudi homegrown invention. Similarly with the UAE, etc. I think that came as how should I say, a seal of approval for a region that was looking for this approval. This is a very far cry from, say, what we heard from President Obama when he went to the region in his first trip, where he was a lot of lecturing and moralizing happening there. So I think in addition to deepening the kind of, you know, foreign policy, national security relation between the US and the region, it also validated a very important trend that we see in the Arab world. Now, it's not without problems. It's not without challenges. I'm sure we will talk about Gaza more. We will talk about the Iran negotiations more. You know, I'm very worried about the US, for example, having direct contacts with Hamas. But there are all of these problems. But I think the trend lines are certainly positive, and the energy that came out of that visit is certainly positive.
So has Trump then changed the face of U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, especially when you brought up Obama in the context of his relations and his trips in the region? And also, you know, he even built his campaign on sort of a rapprochement with Tehran.
Yes, he did. Up to a point, though. I mean, first of all, you know, that's a region where symbolism matters. And the kind of, you know, pomp and circumstance that accompanied all of this played very well there. It's a region that, again, I mean, we often look in diplomacy. We often focus on deliverables, and we forget that the intangibles are very important. And when I talk to friends in the region, in the Gulf in particular, the question they always ask me is, why are you Americans not paying attention to the major transformation happening in our societies? Well, now we're paying attention, and positive attention. So I think this is all has changed. Now, what has that changed, though? And to keep things in perspective, is there still very much concern in the region when it comes to the Iranian nuclear program and what comes out of those negotiations? I think right now we see this concern by the region trying to hedge. So, you know, we know the Saudis, for example, are very uncomfortable with the Islamic regime in Iran. We know that they look at them as a strategic threat. Yet, because they don't feel that the US can be trusted to stay the course, they're hedging and they're doing some rapprochement with the Ayatollahs. You know, the region was very happy with the American campaign against the Houthis, and the region was shocked with the speed in which this happened. So there is maybe a resetting of the diplomatic image of the United States, but I think there's also a deepening sense that the US right now cannot be relied on as a traditional guarantor of security, and we have to look at other ways of getting the US involved.
Oh, that's really interesting. So let's talk more about President Trump's, whirlwind trip in the Persian Gulf, multi-million-dollar deals, some overtures to Syria. I believe he called the leader of Syria very attractive and a strong man. And then, of course, like you said, some potentially French optimism about a potential nuclear deal with Iran. Now, as a former, as you said, Palestinian negotiator, you were under Mahmoud Abbas. How do you view his trip as, from a negotiating perspective? Was it successful? And in some ways, Trump uniting with these neighboring countries of Iran, did that in some ways alienate Iran and potentially embolden hardliners, or is it pushing Iran closer to some sort of deal?
I mean, with the caveat that I'm not a deep expert on Iran, my sense is what this trip did was create an opportunity for Iran if it chooses to take it. I think the president was very clear. He wants diplomacy. He prefers diplomacy. I think the president went out of his way to show how beneficial a relation with the United States can be through all of the deals that we saw in the Gulf. It's up to Iran whether or not to take this opportunity or not. I am, disturbed, though not particularly shocked, by the fact that what we're coming from Iranian officials is more of a hardline position. I think, but again, Iran has to understand if it wants to become part of the prosperous region, then there are certain conditions. And not only ones relating to the nuclear program, but one relating to having positive relations with the neighbors. Iran cannot continue to meddle and undermine and destabilize the region, which it continues to do. I mean, only recently we've seen the uncovering of terror plots in Jordan, a country with no borders with Iran, with no Shia population, yet the regime is going after it.
Trying to destabilize the kingdom there.
Of course. No, I mean, they were working with the Muslim Brotherhood, not only politically, but also through some terror plots, some very clear manufacturing of explosives, of drones, of rockets, etc. And Iran also has to understand that its project has been dealt a major blow. I mean, frankly, between Israel and the United States, Iran has been shown to be a paper tiger. When Israel attacks it twice and Iran is incapable of responding, when the Israelis completely destroy Iran's air defense capabilities and the regime is unable to respond, when the key Iranian assets in the region have been completely neutralized from Hezbollah, most importantly Syria. And by the way, this is where I think the president's decision to engage with the current Syrian government, problematic as it is, we all know what their background and history is. Yet this is a regime that basically says we don't want to have problems with our neighbors. They've been talking with the Israelis. They've been fighting the drug and weapon smuggling to Jordan, etc. But they're also very clear in that this is a regime that just is not going to allow Syria to become the node in the Iranian influence strategy. So Iran has to understand that today the choice is theirs. They can play ball, and I think there's a lot of benefits, or they can continue to be confrontational with much more reduced capabilities, and the result will be bad for the Iranian people. And I will just conclude by saying, when the president compared what you see in Riyadh, and I've been in Riyadh recently, and it's just, I mean, it's mind-boggling, the construction, the modernization, the infrastructure, and compare it with what you're seeing in Iran, rolling electricity blackouts, etc. These are the choices, and I think the president put them in very, very stark terms.
Yeah, I know. I think I've been seeing a lot of Iranians on social media. They were tweeting pictures of Riyadh and then of some places in Iran where, it used to be green and lush with water and now it's completely desert. And then they compared it to Saudi Arabia where MBS has literally turned, deserts into streams and riverways, and complete opposite.
Negar, for many of us, of my generation at least, who grew up in the region, we always looked at Iran as this kind of hub of culture. an old rich culture, art, music, all of that. And look at what's happening today. So I think, I mean, and I think this is the challenge facing not the Iranian people, the Iranian regime. Does it make Iran great again? It has all of the kind of components of being great: history, culture, economy, or will it continue going on this path that has not only brought misery to the region, but misery to Iran itself?
And, as someone of Iranian origin, I appreciate you saying that. Thank you for it. It does mean a lot to us. So when you recognize the identity and the culture and the history, and also the distinction between the government and its people. And in terms of Trump's trip to the Persian Gulf, one thing that he said that stood out to me that didn't get a lot of media attention is he point blank said, Iran, you should be thanking Qatar for lobbying to prevent U.S. military action in Iran. Now, we've known for a long time, obviously, Doha and Tehran do have relations, but for a U.S. president to publicly acknowledge this, make it official, do you view that as significant in your opinion?
I actually don't know what to make of that, to be perfectly honest. Look, I mean, Qatar is a very problematic actor. You rightly said it has had not only relations with Iran, all Gulf regions, countries have relations with Iran, but it has partnership with Iran in many ways. And, that's different from some of the others. Qatar, put aside Iran, I look at it from an Arab perspective. Qatar has been the supporter of Hamas, the supporter of Muslim Brotherhood, the supporter of disruption throughout the region, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, the Qataris are smart, and they do know how to make themselves of value. So they are making themselves of value today to the U.S. through Israel through the hostage negotiations, through the American Air Force base there, which is an important asset for the U.S. Now, when it comes to Iran, I suspect that when the Qatari leaders heard this coming out from Trump's mouth, they were not happy. The Qataris like these problematic relations to be behind the scenes and to be hush hush. And so, I'm sure, just like you noticed it, I'm sure others of Iran's opponents in the region also noticed it. I'm sure the Saudis were, some eyebrows were raised. I'm sure the Israelis heard it. At the end of the day, though, I think, Trump being Trump, he doesn't like to play this subtle behind the scenes game. He says it as it is. And for the Qataris, if they want to get the goodies out of this, well, they have to get used to paying the price for it. So far, they have not paid the price. But I suspect, if things sour between the administration and Iran, and that's a very high possibility. If the negotiations fail, then things can take a very ugly turn. I think that's when the Qataris might find themselves stuck in this. In many ways, though, I'm happy that the president did highlight this because the Qataris cannot play this double game anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's now officially, as we can say, out in the open. And now Trump reportedly also during that trip announced his intention to accept, quote unquote, a gift from the Qatari leadership during that same trip, while asking the Qataris to step in and to help mediate with Iran and to push them closer to this deal. What do you make of that dynamic?
I mean, look, first of all, when you've lost Laura Loomer, for the listeners who don't know who that is, that's one of the most vocal supporters of President Trump. When you've lost her, when she's criticizing this airplane deal, you have a problem. I think, look, Qatar has often tried to use its tremendous financial resources to buy influence. Often, by the way, doing it in very, very legal, legitimate ways. I mean, they're not doing bribery or not. But however, this does raise questions of conflict of interest. This does raise ethical issues. And this does raise a major question on whether or not Qatar is an honest mediator. Frankly, many believe, and I know the Palestinian file more than the Iranian ones, but many believe that in the hostage negotiations between Hamas and the Israelis, Qatar has not put enough pressure on Hamas. And I think for Qatar, when they see the president accepting this gift, they know that they can continue getting away with not doing the most that they can do to advance American interests. I think it was unfortunate. I think that's a very unfortunate action. And I do believe if the Qataris don't feel that they have to, that they're coming under pressure let's say, refrain from their negative action and put their best efforts to advance American interests, unless they feel there's a price to be paid, I fear that they will continue playing this double game.
So that could potentially, would that jeopardize, a quote unquote good deal with Iran then when it comes on the nuclear front?
I don't think so, because I don't think the Qataris are playing a major role when it comes to that. The actual mediation is happening with the Omanis, with the Italians, and it's really a bilateral. I mean, that's the. I think though it will be problematic around the edges. It will be problematic when it comes to things that might not be directly part of the negotiations, but for example, the Iranian proxy project, the Iranian destabilizing rhetoric and public diplomacy, which Qatar amplifies through Al Jazeera and others. I think this is where the Qataris can play a negative role. But I think when it comes to the nuclear, the Qataris are just not a player.
That's interesting.
I mean, I have concerns in other places. I'm not sure if the American position is strong enough. And when it comes to enrichment and think of this kind, and the mixed messaging coming from Washington is just not a good negotiation strategy. But I don't think Qatar is going to be part of that problem.
So they're separate issues. Now, Trump also claimed that Iran, quote, sort of agreed to a nuclear deal, while also, taking aim at the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, saying, you're stealing from the wealth of your people. And, obviously that language struck a chord with a lot of Iranians who are against the regime. And, they've been saying this for decades now. Why do you suppose that Trump chose, some of the Persian Gulf states to deliver this message to the people of Iran rather than from the United States?
I think part of it because, proximity. I am sure the Iranian people, like all the other people in the region, were watching this trip. I think that's part of it. I think part of it, which is what we mentioned earlier, to kind of draw the contrast between, two very close countries, Iran and Saudi, just a small body of water between them, and a success story versus a failure story. I think, part of it is Trump's own attention span. That was the Middle East week in which he just wanted to deliver all of his Middle East stuff. And now he's back in Washington, dealing with other stuff. I think it's a combination of the above. But I do believe that, again, going to the region, in a Middle Eastern country, in a Muslim country, and coming and saying to the people, you have one model here and you have one model here, and the choice is yours. I think that was the most important aspect of the choice of venue in making that message.
Yeah, that's a really great way to frame it. And you were also part of some of the most, consequential peace talks of the early 2000s, Camp David, of course. And today you serve as a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. So you really understand both worlds, like this Western policy-making world and the Middle East framework and their negotiating and those dynamics. Based on that, how do you see Trump's vision of the region, like you mentioned, failure versus success, and where does Iran fit into this future?
I mean, again, it's very hard because, as you know, Trump is not a typical president. So our ability to kind of analyze and predict is limited because, for good or for ill, and it's often, both, he will surprise us. That said, we're starting to see, I think, some of the outlines. Some of the outlines is Trump wants success. He will engage in success. He will partner with countries that have something to add to the United States. So when the Saudis and the Qataris and the Emiratis come and say, here, we're going to invest, he partners with them. When the Jordanians come and say, here, we're going to partner with you on intelligence and military issues, he'll partner with them. If a country comes to him and just makes demands, he has no patience for that. So that's one. I think, on the other hand, what is also very clear is that the U.S. is not going to be taking, in general, is not going to be micromanaging the region. We see it in their approach with the Israelis, and I think this is one of the first things that I've heard from an administration official after Trump came on is we're not going to micromanage the Israelis. However, at the same time, they have objectives, and if your partner doesn't meet the objective, then the Americans will intervene, and that's why we started seeing some of the pressure on the Israelis last week to wind down in Gaza. I think, though, that Iran is a unique issue. Iran is a unique issue because the nuclear question is not a run-of-the-mill, issue. A nuclear Iran is not a Middle East problem. It's a global problem. It's an American problem. So I think in this we will see specific focus, and it's no coincidence again that the president has tasked his most trusted aide, Steve Witkoff, with running this. I think while the U.S. This president has no appetite for military action, I do believe that the question of a military response to Iran is not off the table. The fact that we had the B-2s in the Diego Garcia, I think the attack on the Houthis was saying that we are willing to use military force. Now, what they're not willing to do is to invade and do regime change, etc. But if Iran thinks that there's no appetite whatsoever to use military force for specific targeted finite operations, they will have to reconsider. Because to me, Iran is one area where this president, and everyone you hear from the administration say that if there is no deal, then there is a price to pay, whether the price is directly American or an Israeli response that is being supported by the U.S. The use of military force continues to be an option.
So could his trip be interpreted as forming or building or showing off sort of potentially a united front against Iran?
I wouldn't say so, because he chose not to highlight this. I think, again, in many ways, but the president, when he did this trip, he partly was doing it as a foreign policy trip, but also a domestic political trip. So he wanted to send to his audience in Washington. He wanted images of happiness and motorcades and all of the kind of bling that you saw in that trip. I don't think he wanted to send a message of confrontation. So that's part of it. But also the other part of it, and it goes back to the kind of shortcoming we mentioned a bit earlier. To build a coalition, you have to have partners who trust that you will see your coalition through. I think right now, while many of those countries are willing, many of the Arab countries are willing to have transactional relations with the United States, I don't think any of those countries are willing to go into military coalitions with with the United States as it stands. I mean, just to give you an example, with the campaign against the Houthis, the U.S. tried to get some of the Arab countries on board, and the Saudis in particular were reluctant. So a couple of weeks ago, once the U.S. announced they're stopping the campaign, a Saudi friend of mine was saying, "You see, we were right not to join the American coalition." He said, like, had we joined, and the U.S. stopped, and suddenly we're left alone there. So I think these Arab countries, unless they trust that the U.S. is willing to see whatever strategy through to the end, they're not willing to go into a coalition, and then the U.S. decides to pull back, and they find themselves exposed. Now, I don't think the U.S. will pull back. However, it's easy for me to say it, sitting from the comfort of my office in Washington. If you're the Saudi crown prince, you have to think of the worst and plan for the worst case scenario. So I think unless the U.S. shows more dependability in terms of seeing this policy through, I think it's going to be very hard to draw a full coalition.
And how would those Arab allies of the United States view a potential deal with Iran? Is that something they want or they don't want? Or
I mean, they want it, of course. I mean, everyone wants a deal. No one wants war. However, I think what they want is a deal that first and foremost blocks the Iranian pathway to a nuclear weapon. And they will judge the deal by its content. And what you hear when you talk to Israelis, what you hear when you talk to Arab officials, their biggest fear is that this negotiations produce something to the similar to the JCPOA, slightly better, slightly worse, and the president being the president will come and say this is the biggest, most beautiful, most great, but in reality, it still allows the Iranian regime a pathway. So for them, they are worried about that possibility, particularly that they're hearing mixed messages coming from Washington in terms of what are the objectives. Is it dismantlement of the nuclear program? Is it enrichment? Is it capping enrichment? Is it? So we don't know. So that's kind of one element. But to be very honest, for these Arab countries, and that was the case since the JCPOA, they see the nuclear problem is the problem for tomorrow. The problem for today is the destabilizing action that Iran continues to do in the Arab world. When an Iranian official says we control 4 Arab capitals. Again, as I mentioned before, when you see them messing around in Jordan, when you see them arming the Houthis who are a threat to the Saudis, when you see them continuing to meddle in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in all of these kind of places. So for the Arab countries, they want to see this dealt with. And I think their biggest frustration, both with the Obama deal, but frankly also with the Trump administration, is that Washington does not prioritize this level. And so the way that these Arab countries deal with it is they will do what they will do, but they will also try to hedge their bets, and they'll try to build their own capabilities to deal with this.
And I watched this recent speech that you gave, and it was really interesting. You referred to the Persian Gulf countries as the center of gravity in the Middle East, and you refer to Egypt and the Levant, Beirut in that area, as being grievance-based, and these Persian Gulf countries as future focus. I've never heard it in those terms before, but I completely understand what you mean. But for our audience, can you expand on that idea, and what does it mean in relation potentially to Iran's position in the region, both diplomatically and economically, when we have future-based versus now this grievance-based societies?
Just to explain to the audience, and I came up with this framing out of just a trip I took last year to the region. I was in Jordan, I was in Egypt. After a week in Cairo or in Amman, you leave basically depressed and needing therapy. Why? Because everyone is telling you how bad life is, all the problems, and there are real problems, no doubt. However, and of course, people talk also about the good old days and a sense of the world against us, and it's very bleak. Then I go to Abu Dhabi or I go to Riyadh, and everyone, from my Uber driver to the cabinet minister, has something in the future looking forward to. A job, a project, a plan, something like this. I think the leadership in those countries has intentionally basically set future goals aside, and with that created a public mood and a public discourse that is focused about how do you achieve those. I tell you an example. I was talking a few years ago to a friend from the UAE, and we're talking about the Emiratis want to get to Mars. And this guy was telling me he was talking to an Emirati official and saying, why do we need this vanity project? And the guy, actually, the Emirati official, said to him, think of the American plan to land a person on the moon back in the 1960s. That was something that united the nation with a vision. I think the Gulf is doing that. And with that, you end up with prosperity. With that, you end up with, I can tell you anecdotally, when I meet in Washington, young people from the Levant, they're all looking for ways to stay in Washington. When I meet young people from the Gulf, studying, they can't wait to finish their degrees and go back to Saudi and to the UAE because they want to be part of something. What that means to Iran, diplomatically speaking, I think right now, at least in the Gulf, they look at Iran as a potential spoiler, and what they're trying to do is to buy off this spoiler. So I believe, that's my own view, that when the Saudis have done their rapprochement with Iran, they know that this regime is not one that is to be trusted. However, if you can buy a couple of years of stability, so be it. But ultimately, I think, unless that region sees a shift in the Iranian direction, then it will never be part of this renaissance in the region. Because I look at, what is the narrative coming from the Iranian regime? It's a narrative of grievance. The whole world is against us. It's a narrative, frankly, rooted in the past, in both past grievances and past glory. I see even their view of the future is more of a symbolic reawakening of Iranian power, not a view of prosperity, not a positive view of how you can be a contributor. So I think ultimately for Iran, it's gonna they have to choose. Now, it's not only a choice, because actually what we have seen in practical terms, that these grievance-based models produce failed states. What's the Arab Spring? The Arab Spring is the failure of governments and political regimes that are all about grievance, all about conspiracy theories, all about blaming the past, and nothing about working at home. And the Arab countries that survived it are the Arab countries that have different model. Today, I look at the trend lines in Iran, and while I'm not an expert, I see the economy has failed. I see the infrastructure has failed. I see that the public is just not united and inspired by what they have to do. So even if they end up with a nuclear deal, if they don't fix themselves domestically, and that's not something that outsiders can do for them. Outsiders can produce a blueprint, can produce assistance. It's an Iranian choice.
And it won't get rid of any of the, as you said, the regional issues and relationships and conflicts that are coming from Iran too.
Of course not. Of course not. And I don't think anyone has any illusions about that. And to tell you the truth, I mean, my view is if the Iranian regime continues on these trend lines, then continued conflict with the various regional actors is guaranteed. With the footnote that with time, Iran gets weaker and the others get stronger.
Yeah, and would that change the way, as you said, as Iran gets weaker and those countries get stronger, would that change the way then how Iran interacts with them?
Again, I think from their perspective, they don't want conflict. By the way, but it's interesting. I mean, a few years ago, the UAE and Saudi were involved in a number of regional conflicts, from Yemen to Libya, etc. I think the lesson they have learned is that conflict never ends well. So they don't want conflict, if you can avoid it. If the Iranians come today and say, we don't want to meddle, we want to improve economic relations, etc., I think they will be more than happy to do that. However, sometimes if Iran continues to be a spoiler, then those countries will have no choice but to, either try to contain it, or frankly, try to undermine it. But I think, again, for those countries right now, if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would have said some of those Arab countries will be pushing for a conflict with Iran. Today, those Arab countries don't want conflict. You want to avoid conflict, but not at any price.
And what changed? Like, what led to this shift then?
I think partly it's a question of maturity. I think, again, when those countries tried engaging in conflict in Yemen and elsewhere, they realized that it's easy to get into a conflict. It's very hard to get out of a conflict. They also understood, as they focus more and more on prosperity, that conflict is not good for the economy, etc. By the way, I look at things like the Abraham Accords as those countries wanting the region to integrate. However, if Iran comes and says, I'm going to be a source of instability no matter what, even if you, Saudi Arabia, want to avoid conflict, I'm going to bring conflict to your backyard, then it becomes hard for those countries to engage positively. And that's why I say, again, if Iran today comes as a partner, not as a bully, and frankly, that's often how they are. Again, I talk about the regime, to be very clear. Not as a bully, not as a blackmailer, but someone who comes and says, let's do business. Business being economic, cultural, etc. I think they will find partners in the region. If they come and say, we don't want to be your partner, you can bring the horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink. And so, again, I keep on going to this theme There's an opportunity for Iran if it wants to take it. The region has changed. The region is eager for integration, but not at any price.
Yeah, and I wonder, in terms of change and integration, then you're dealing with a country that is run with ideology too, right? There's that ideological factor as well.
I mean, by the way, that's another element. This is another major shift in what I see in the Gulf versus the Levant. I mean, our history, the Arab political history, much of the 20th century was all about big ideologies. Pan-Arabism, Baathism, Muslim Brotherhood. And look what this brought us. Misery, dysfunction, failure, etc. The Gulf is non-ideological. In the sense, and I think, when you talk to Gulf officials, leaders, they will tell you, as a leader, I have only one job. That's it. My job is how to make life better for my people. My job is not to go and, spread Islam everywhere or spread pan-Arabism everywhere. My job is for my people. This is completely incompatible with the ideological mindset, including in Iran. Again, I look at how much resources this regime has put outside Iran, supporting the Assad regime, supporting Hezbollah, supporting this, supporting that. This is a mindset, this is a view of the world that's just incompatible with what the new Middle East looks like. If you focus on, and by the way, focusing on what's good for your people doesn't mean you're isolationist. On the contrary, I think in the Gulf, they understood that regional integration is key. That's why they reached out to Israel. That's why today when I go particularly the UAE, I hear more about investment in Africa and relations in Southeast Asia, etc., than I hear about the Middle East. They're not isolationist, but they look at foreign policy not as a dominance game, but as a mutual interest game. Again, Iran can either play this game to the benefit of Iran and the Iranian people, or it can choose to continue the old ideologically driven, dominance driven approach, which unfortunately, I say, would only accrue to the detriment of the Iranian people and interests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when you speak of, supporting the people in the Persian Gulf, their leaders, with Trump and all these economic deals that he's made, wouldn't the United States then have an incentive to want to avoid any kind of regional tension or war because that could disrupt their own economic partnerships? What do you think about that angle?
That's absolutely correct. However, that coin has another side. And that side is, if these interests are threatened, then the US also has an incentive to protect those interests. And I suspect, the Saudis wanted a defense treaty with the United States. Frankly, specifically to protect them against Iranian aggression. It became very clear, I think, at some point to the Saudis that you just cannot get a treaty. In the United States, getting a defense treaty, I think the last defense treaty the US signed was in the 1960s. You need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. American politics, you cannot get 2/3 to agree if it's night or day outside. So I think part of the Saudi approach is saying, okay, invest in the Saudi Arabia, put some money, put American companies, put AI data centers, etc. That the U.S. has an interest in preserving it. So while American engagement certainly incentivizes the U.S. to push for integration and stabilization, it also gives the U.S. a real interest that it has to protect if the interests are being threatened. And that, I think, by the way, is a lesson that the Iranian regime has to understand. Right now, and I suspect things in the coming years, the American presence in the region is not simply going to be a military presence. We're going to be seeing a major investment presence. And if there's a major investment presence, then the American interest in the region will multiply, and the American incentive to protect these interests will multiply.
Well, sorry, my mind is going into a million places. I'm just, just contemplating the future of the Middle East, and everything's changing, and the relationship between the United States and the Middle East, and it seems like a dawn of a new era, almost, yeah.
I mean, again, with the caveat that this is the Middle East.
Yeah, you never know, right? Yeah.
You never know. And unfortunately, I think I made the point earlier, what we've seen in the history of the Middle East is sometimes when big opportunities present themselves, the spoilers become more motivated to spoil.
Yeah, like
Uh,
October 7th,
like
the
October 7th.
normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so I don't expect a smooth ride. Yet I'm seeing potential today that I have not seen in my many years of working the region. I see a transformation. Um, Anything guaranteed? Of course, nothing is guaranteed. Is the U.S. engagement guaranteed? Of course, it's not. Again, this is an administration that's unpredictable. But just going by the momentum that we saw from the president's trip, seeing the opportunities, I am with you. I mean, I'm with you in that, as you said, I often sit there and kind of see all these kind of possibilities out there. And it's a question of who has the kind of creativity, initiative, agility, and will to take these opportunities.
cautiously optimistic, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And just to conclude, did Trump's Persian Gulf tour in any way ultimately tilt the balance of power in favor of any country? Did anyone particularly benefit? What do you think, if at all?
I actually think how should I say, clarified the obvious. And the obvious is the center of gravity, at least in the Arab world, I would argue in the region right now, is Saudi Arabia. I think this has become very clear. I think the winners in this, first and foremost, the Gulf. I think Syria, we have not talked about Syria. I think that's huge. Syria has been a spoiler in the region since the 1970s. And now Syria is not a spoiler, and now we have opportunity to put that on track. The losers, I think, are those who wanted to stay in the old thick. I think, we talked a lot about the message that was sent to Iran, directly or indirectly. You have two choices. I look at Egypt. I think there was a message to Egypt as well, implicitly. If you want to become important again, you have something to do. So I think it was sending a message to the region. If you want to stick in the old think, you're going nowhere. If you want to embrace the new think, then you will have support coming from the not only from the region, from the US. This is, by the way, a major shift in American approaches. You remember when Biden was campaigning in his first campaign, he talked about Saudi as a pariah. He looked at Saudi only in the traditional way of looking at it. Right now, I think this was an indication that the US is looking at the Middle East, understanding the new developments. If you, as a Middle East country, is willing to jump on this bandwagon, you can benefit. If not, you'll be left behind.
So completely, new era between the Middle East and Trump. Is there anything you'd like to add, Ghaith, that we haven't touched on?
I mean, how many hours do we have? No, really. I mean,
as long as you want. I can listen to you for hours.
No. I mean, honestly, the only thing I'm just adding, I think I'm going to stay with the same theme. We are so used to the Middle East being a source of bad news. And of course, it continues to be. I mean, we have to be blind to ignore the human tragedies that we see all over. However, I think what this trip showed is that with the right kind of leadership, the Middle East can also be a place of opportunity. And in an America that is focused on America first, as it were, how do you improve American chances? I think the Middle East now has presented itself as an area that could be a great partner, both for the US, but also for the area's interests. So for once, we can have a Middle East conversation and not be completely depressed.
I can only hope. Thank you, Ghaith. You gave me some hope today. That's Ghaith al-Omari joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
Likewise. Now, if you like this episode, hit the like button. Also, leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.